My name is Robert Callahan, and I am 74 years old. 2 months ago, at my son's country club, in front of nearly 100 of the most well-dressed people I had ever seen in one room, my daughter-in-law told me, quietly but clearly enough for the people near us to hear, that I was an embarrassment. She said it while straightening my collar like she was fixing a stain, like the words cost her nothing at all. What she didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom knew, except one man in dress blues standing near the entrance, was that in about 11 minutes, a decorated general was going to walk across that room, past senators and CEOs and old money families, straight to me, and salute. If you've ever been made to feel like a stain on your own family's reputation, stay with me, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about the moment an old man realizes his worth was never something anyone else got to decide. I need to tell you who I was before that night, because otherwise you won't understand why the general's arrival meant what it meant. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner who died of black lung when I was 19. I enlisted in the Army 2 weeks after his funeral because there wasn't much else for a boy like me, and because staying in that town felt like staying in a grave I hadn't been buried in yet. I served 29 years, 3 tours. I retired a full colonel, though by the time I left the service, most of what I'd done couldn't be talked about at dinner parties, because most of what I'd done was classified, strategic, the kind of work that shapes wars without ever making headlines. I met my wife, Eleanor, at a base in Georgia. She was a nurse, sharp-tongued and kind in equal measure, and she was the only person who ever made me feel like more than my uniform. We had one son, Peter, born on an army base in Germany, raised across 6 different states before he turned 12. Eleanor passed 6 years ago. A stroke, sudden, no warning, the kind of loss that doesn't give you time to prepare and doesn't give you closure either. Since then, it's just been me, in a modest house outside Richmond, filling my days with a garden Eleanor used to love and a workshop where I restore old radios, a hobby that keeps my hands busy when my mind gets too quiet. Peter grew up to be a successful corporate attorney. I'm proud of him, genuinely, deeply proud, the way any father is proud of a son who built something real. He married Vanessa about 8 years ago. Vanessa comes from a family with roots in old Virginia money. Her father sits on the board of 2 Fortune 500 companies. Her mother chairs charity galas that make the society pages. Vanessa herself is polished in a way I've never fully understood. The kind of polish that seems to require constant maintenance, like a car that's beautiful but needs premium fuel and can't be parked on the street. From the beginning, there was a coolness between Vanessa and me that never quite thawed. I don't think she was ever outright cruel in those early years. It was more that I represented a category she didn't have a comfortable place for. Not embarrassing exactly, just unpolished. A retired military man who wore the same 3 sport coats to every family function, who didn't know the difference between a Cabernet and a Bordeaux, who called people ma'am and sir out of habit rather than performance. Peter and Vanessa have 2 children, Grace and Oliver, 12 and 9. Those grandchildren are the best part of my remaining years, and to Vanessa's credit, she never kept them from me. I saw them regularly, took them fishing, taught Oliver how to disassemble and reassemble an old radio, the way Eleanor used to watch me do the same thing decades earlier. But as the years passed, and as Vanessa's social circle grew more prominent, country club memberships, charity board seats, the kind of world where appearances carry real currency, I noticed myself being managed more carefully. Invited to smaller family dinners, but quietly steered away from the larger events. The ones with cameras. The ones with people whose names appeared in the newspaper. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd spent nearly 30 years learning that pride is a luxury a soldier can't always afford, and I applied that same discipline to my personal life. If Vanessa was more comfortable keeping me at arm's length from her social world, I wasn't going to make a fight out of it. I had my garden, my radios, my grandchildren, my quiet Sunday calls with Peter. It was enough. I told myself it was enough. Then, 2 months ago, Peter called and asked me to come to a gala at his country club, a formal fundraising dinner for a veterans charity, of all things, hosted by Vanessa's family's foundation. He said Vanessa specifically wanted me there this time, that it would mean a lot to have me present, given the veterans theme. I was surprised, genuinely touched, and I said yes without hesitation. I bought a new suit for the occasion, the first new suit I'd purchased since Eleanor's funeral. I had my shoes shined. I arrived early, the way I always do, an old habit from decades of being the first man in the room for every briefing I ever attended. The ballroom was stunning. Chandeliers, a string quartet, waiters moving through the crowd with trays of champagne. I recognized a few faces from the news, a state senator, a well-known philanthropist, the CEO of a company whose commercials I'd seen 100 times. I felt, for the first time in years, slightly out of my depth, though I told myself that discomfort was mine to manage, not anyone else's problem. Vanessa found me near the entrance about 20 minutes in. She looked stunning as always, in a deep emerald gown, moving through the room like she'd been born knowing exactly how to occupy a space like that. She smiled at me, a real smile, I thought at first, and reached up to straighten my collar, the way you'd fix a child's shirt before a school photo. "Robert," she said, her voice pitched low, pleasant on the surface, but with an edge underneath it that I recognized immediately, the way you recognize weather changing before the sky actually shows it. "I need you to understand something before my parents' friends start arriving. This is an important night for my family's foundation. Half the guest list tonight decides where significant charitable dollars go in this state. I love that you wanted to come, I really do, but I need you to just blend in tonight. Don't tell your war stories. Don't correct anyone's pronunciation of military terms. Just smile, be polite, and try not to embarrass us in front of people who matter." I stood very still. "Embarrass you," I repeated. "You know what I mean," she said, still smiling that pleasant hostess smile for the benefit of anyone watching. "You're a sweet man, Robert, truly, but you're not exactly—" She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this moment, or something like it, in her head before. "You're not exactly this world, and tonight, more than most nights, appearances matter enormously. I need tonight to go smoothly. I need you to just be low-key." She patted my arm once, like she'd resolved something, and moved off to greet a couple arriving through the main doors, her laugh already ringing out, warm and practiced, for their benefit. I stood there for a long moment, in my new suit, holding a champagne flute I hadn't touched, feeling smaller than I had felt in longer than I could remember. Not because of the words themselves. I'd been called worse things by worse people in my life, and survived far harder rooms than a charity gala. It was the casualness of it, the way she'd said, "Embarrass us," the way you'd mention a stain on a tablecloth. In front of Peter, who I noticed had heard every word and said nothing, his jaw tight, staring down into his drink. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. Not anger, not at first, something quieter and heavier, a kind of tired familiarity, like I was watching a door that had been slowly closing for 8 years, finally click shut all the way. I found a quiet corner near the back of the ballroom, away from the crowd, and I stood there for a while, watching the room move around me like water around a stone. I thought about Eleanor, about what she would have said if she'd heard those words. I thought about 29 years of a career I'd never once needed anyone's approval to be proud of, and I decided, standing there in that corner, that I would simply do exactly what Vanessa asked. Blend in, say nothing, get through the evening quietly, for Peter's sake, and go home to my radios and my garden, where I never had to shrink myself for anyone. I had no idea, standing in that corner, that the evening was about to turn in a direction none of us could have predicted. About 40 minutes later, there was a stir near the main entrance, the particular kind of ripple that moves through a crowded room when someone important arrives. I looked up along with everyone else and saw a tall man in full dress blues walking through the doors, medals catching the chandelier light, moving with the unmistakable bearing of someone who has spent a lifetime being the person a room organizes itself around. I recognized him immediately, though it had been nearly 15 years since I'd last seen him in person. General Marcus Ellison, 4 stars, currently serving as one of the most senior commanding officers in the entire Army. I had followed his career from a distance over the years, the way you follow the career of someone whose success you had a quiet hand in building, the way a teacher follows a former student who went on to do something remarkable with what you taught them. 22 years earlier, Marcus Ellison had been a young captain assigned to my command during a deployment that I still, to this day, cannot discuss in detail. He was talented but reckless in those early years, the kind of officer whose instincts were good, but whose discipline hadn't caught up to his ambition yet. I spent the better part of 18 months working with him directly, breaking down bad habits, rebuilding better ones, pushing him harder than I pushed almost anyone under my command, because I saw something in him worth that investment. Years later, I heard through old military channels that he credited that deployment, and specifically the mentorship I'd given him, as the turning point of his entire career. I had no idea he would be at this particular gala. I had no idea, standing quietly in my corner in an unfamiliar ballroom, that the room was about to shift entirely around me. General Ellison moved through the receiving line, shaking hands with the senator, with the foundation chairman, with Vanessa's father, all the practiced warmth of a man used to ceremonial obligations. And then, as he scanned the room the way men trained to assess a space always do, his eyes landed on me, standing quietly in my corner, and I watched his entire posture change. He excused himself from the group around him, mid-sentence, mid-handshake, in a way that clearly startled the people he was standing with, and walked directly across that crowded ballroom, past senators, past CEOs, past the entire assembled weight of old Virginia money, straight toward me. He stopped in front of me, came to full attention, and saluted. "Colonel Callahan," he said, his voice carrying further than I think he intended, cutting cleanly through the low hum of conversation around us. "Sir, I had no idea you'd be here tonight. It is genuinely an honor. I want you to understand what that ballroom looked like in that moment." Nearly 100 conversations stopped mid-sentence. Vanessa, standing near the center of the room, turned white as a sheet, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Peter's head snapped up so fast I heard him inhale sharply from 15 feet away. "At ease, Marcus," I said quietly, though I couldn't entirely keep the warmth out of my voice. "It's good to see you. It's been a long time." "Sir, I've told this story more times than I can count," General Ellison said, and now he'd turned slightly, addressing not just me but, whether he realized it or not, the small crowd that had begun to gather within earshot. "I would not be standing in this uniform today, commanding what I command, if it weren't for 18 months under this man's direct instruction. Colonel Callahan broke me down to nothing and rebuilt me into an officer worth following. Every hard call I have made in the last 2 decades traces back to lessons this man drilled into me when I was a green captain who thought he already knew everything." The room had gone genuinely quiet now. I saw the foundation chairman turn to Vanessa's father with raised eyebrows. I saw the state senator lean toward his wife and whisper something. I saw Vanessa standing frozen near the center of the room, the color still not returned to her face. "Sir, would you do me the honor of joining me at the head table tonight?" General Ellison asked. "I'd like the opportunity to properly introduce you to some people who I think would be very interested to know exactly who trained the man currently commanding this region's forces." I glanced, briefly, at Peter, whose expression I still think about, somewhere between shock, pride, and something that looked almost like grief, for 8 years of quiet dinners where nobody had ever thought to ask what his father actually did with 29 years of his life. "I'd be honored, Marcus," I said. What followed was, I'll admit, one of the strangest and most surreal hours of my life. I sat at the head table of a gala I had been told, less than an hour earlier, to simply blend into, while a 4-star general told a room full of the state's most influential people, in vivid and generous detail, about strategic decisions I'd made decades earlier, that most of them, I could tell, had never fully understood the weight of until that moment. The state senator asked me detailed questions about military strategy that I answered as carefully as classification allowed. The foundation chairman, I later learned, would go on to specifically request that a portion of that evening's charitable proceeds be redirected toward a veterans transition program inspired directly by the conversation. Vanessa did not approach our table for nearly 45 minutes. When she finally did, her face had regained its color, but something in her expression had changed entirely. The practiced hostess smile replaced by something more uncertain, almost fragile. "Robert," she said quietly, when there was finally a lull in the conversation. "I didn't know. I had no idea any of this was. I'm so sorry. I said something terrible to you earlier, and I need you to know how sorry I am." I looked at her for a long moment. "I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let the silence sit there a little longer, let her feel the full weight of what she'd said an hour earlier. But I thought of Eleanor, and what she would have wanted from me, and I found something gentler instead. "Vanessa," I said, "I appreciate you saying that, but I need you to understand something, and I say this without anger. What you said to me earlier tonight, that hurt, more than I let on. Not because of what I actually did in my career. That was never something I needed anyone's validation for. It hurt because it confirmed something I'd suspected for 8 years, that in your eyes, I was a category to be managed rather than a person to be known. And the truth is, Vanessa, I would have been just as worthy of basic respect tonight, even if General Ellison had never walked through that door. My worth was never contingent on a 4-star general recognizing my name in a crowded ballroom. It was already there. You just never asked the right questions to find it." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes glistening. "You're right," she finally said. "You're completely right. I judged you based on things that never should have mattered. Your suits, your manners, the fact that you didn't move through rooms like this the way my family does. And the whole time, I never once asked you a real question about who you actually were before you became my father-in-law. I'm ashamed of that, Robert, genuinely ashamed." Peter joined us then, and I watched something pass between him and his wife. A conversation without words, the kind that happens after 8 years of marriage when something fundamental has shifted. "Dad," Peter said, "I should have said something earlier tonight. When Vanessa said what she said, I heard it and I said nothing, and that's on me as much as it's on her. I've let this go on too long. This idea in our house that you needed to be managed instead of celebrated. I'm sorry, Dad. That's overdue, and I mean it." We stayed at that gala until nearly midnight. Vanessa asked me, for the first time in 8 years, real questions about my career. Not performative ones, but genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from someone finally seeing a person clearly for the first time. General Ellison rejoined us twice more throughout the evening, and at one point pulled Peter aside privately, though Peter told me the next day exactly what was said. That in Marcus Ellison's entire career, he had never met a finer officer or a better man than his father, and that Peter should count himself fortunate every single day to carry my name. 2 weeks later, Vanessa called and asked if she could take me to lunch. Just the two of us. We sat for nearly 3 hours at a quiet restaurant, far from any country club, and she asked me everything. About Eleanor, about my childhood in Scranton, about the 29 years of service she'd spent nearly a decade reducing to an afterthought at family gatherings. At the end of it, she said something I still think about. "I spent 8 years being embarrassed by a man who was, this whole time, one of the most accomplished people I have ever had the privilege of knowing. I don't know how to undo that, Robert, but I want to spend the rest of the years we have trying." Grace and Oliver's school is hosting a Veterans Day program next month, and for the first time, Vanessa personally called the organizer and asked if I would be willing to speak. I said yes. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old man who got called an embarrassment at a party. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. There will be people in your life, sometimes people who share your last name, sometimes people who sit across your dinner table every Sunday, who will decide your worth based on categories that have nothing to do with who you actually are. Suits, manners, the way you hold a wine glass. That doesn't mean your worth isn't real. It means it's been quietly waiting, sometimes for years, for a moment when the truth simply refuses to stay hidden any longer. I spent 8 years being managed at my own family's social events. It turns out, the men I led into some of the hardest moments of their careers Never once needed a country club to recognize exactly who I was. If this story reminded you of someone in your life who deserves more credit than they've ever received, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight.